He was worth $87 billion, a sum so vast it had ceased to be money and had become a gravitational force, bending markets and governments to his will. She was worth $17.50 an hour, plus the hope of tips, a sum so small it was perpetually being devoured by rent, bills, and the crushing weight of a debt she could never repay. Holden Van Doren, a man who had carved his empire from the bedrock of corporate America with the ruthless precision of a diamond cutter, did not speak to the help. He did not acknowledge them. To him, the waitress filling his water glass was no more sentient than the crystal it was made from. She was a function, a ghost in a black and white uniform, and he was about to make a mistake that would jeopardize the single most important deal of his life. He was seething. The negotiation was imploding. His partners were on the verge of walking, and the entire foundation of his legacy project was crumbling to dust. He didn't know that the invisible girl in the shadows wasn't just there to serve his Pellegrino. She was the one person on Earth who held the lock, the key, and the map. And she was about to use them all. The air inside the Gilded Stag wasn't just air. It was a carefully curated atmosphere of power, a symphony of hushed tones, the clink of heavy silver on bone china, and the scent of seared scallops mingling with vintage Rothschild. It was a place where fortunes were made and dismantled, between the appetizer and the main course. For Vivian Adler, it was the 9th circle of a very specific, exhausting hell. At 26, she had perfected the art of invisibility. She moved with a practiced economy of motion, her footsteps silenced by the plush Aubusson carpet. Her uniform was a shroud, rendering her anonymous. Her entire being was compressed into a set of polite, pre-programmed responses. A deferential nod, a quiet "right away, sir," and the muscle memory required to carry a tray laden with food worth more than her monthly salary. Every cell in her body screamed in protest. She was 10 hours into a 14-hour double shift, and the meager collection of tips in her apron pocket felt like a cruel joke. Tucked inside her locker, a final, crimson-stamped notice from the Meadowlark Assisted Living Facility felt heavier than the world. They were threatening to move her father. Tonight, her section included the dreaded Table 4, the corner booth known among the staff as the Summit. Its sole occupant, for now, was Holden Van Doren. You didn't need to know his name to feel the shift in the room's polarity when he entered. He was the founder and CEO of Van Doren Capital, a predator who devoured companies whole. He was in his mid-40s, with hair the color of iron and eyes that seemed to absorb all light, leaving none to escape. He was dressed in a suit so exquisitely tailored it looked less like fabric and more like a second, more formidable skin. He didn't look at Vivienne. His gaze passed through her as if she were made of glass. He was expecting guests. 2 men, elders from the Diné Nation, the Navajo people. They were not just tribal leaders. They were the stewards of the Diné Sovereign Trust, a fund controlling mineral and resource rights over a territory larger than West Virginia, including the rights to the largest untapped lithium deposit in North America. Holden wanted that lithium. He needed it for his pivot into green energy. The men arrived. They were older, with faces like ancient, weathered landscapes, and they moved with a quiet dignity that made Holden's aggressive stillness seem coarse by comparison. With them was a translator, a young, eager man named Mr. Davies, whose suit was a size too big and whose smile was a size too nervous. "The server is here, Mr. Van Doren," Davies announced, as if presenting a piece of furniture. Holden didn't look up from the schematics on his tablet. He gestured with 2 fingers, a flick of the wrist one might use to dismiss a gnat. "Water. Still. And the 82 Petrus. Go." Vivian felt the familiar sting, but her expression remained a mask of serene neutrality. "Right away, Mr. Van Doren." She retreated to the service station, her hands betraying a slight tremor as she uncorked the wine, a bottle that would have paid for 2 months of her father's care. "Go." Not please, not a flicker of acknowledgement, just a command, as if to a machine. She returned and poured the wine with a practiced, steady hand she didn't feel. As she filled the glasses, the conversation at the table, a stilted mix of English and translated pleasantries, began to curdle. Davies, the translator, was floundering. "Mr. Van Doren, sir," he stammered, fiddling with his tie. "They are expressing concerns about the environmental impact studies. They feel they are insufficient." "Insufficient?" Holden's voice was a low growl, a rumble of distant thunder. "I paid the top firm in the country $10 million for those studies. Tell them they are the most sufficient studies in the history of environmental science. Tell them the terms are final." Davies paled and relayed the message. Vivienne, standing just out of earshot but required to remain close, felt a cold dread bloom in her chest. His translation was a catastrophe. It wasn't just inaccurate. It was a masterclass in cultural ignorance. He was using direct, almost confrontational phrasing, stripping the elders' words of all their inherent diplomacy and respect. He was translating their words, but not their meaning. The elder of the two men, Mr. Bigay, placed his fork down with a quiet, deliberate click that sounded like a gavel. He turned to his companion, Mr. Yazzie, and began to speak. He spoke in their native tongue, Diné Bizard, the Navajo language. The words were fluid, complex, a cascade of tones and glottal stops that sounded to the uninitiated like the flow of a river over stones. Davies, the translator, looked utterly lost. He smiled weakly, a man adrift in a sea of alien sound. "Sir," Davies whispered to Holden, sweat beading on his forehead, I'm afraid I don't have any proficiency in their native dialect." Holden's face, already a thundercloud, went dark as a winter storm. "You told me you were fluent in the languages of the region. What the hell am I paying you for?" "I am, sir. I speak Apache, Zuni. I thought—" Mr. Bigay's voice cut through the tension. He looked directly at Holden, his eyes dark and disappointed, and spoke one clear, sharp sentence in his own language before falling silent. "What did he say?" Holden demanded, his knuckles white on the table. Davies stammered, I'm not sure, sir. It's a very complex tonal language. I think the word for deal was in there, and something that sounded like sky." Holden was about to erupt. Vivienne saw the deal, the lithium, her own desperate hope for a decent tip, all of it circling the drain. And then she moved. It wasn't a decision. It was an instinct, a reflex forged in a childhood spent at the feet of a man who believed knowledge was the only true currency. "No," a quiet voice said. The table fell silent. Holden Van Doren turned his head slowly, and for the very first time, he truly saw her. His steel-grey eyes, filled with a terrifying, incandescent rage, fixed on the waitress. "What did you just say to me?" Vivienne looked past him, her gaze resting respectfully on Mr. Bigay. She gave a slight, deferential bow of her head, not as a servant, but as one who understands protocol. And then she spoke. Her voice was quiet, yet it filled the sudden, absolute silence of the booth. She spoke in fluent, perfectly accented Diné Bizard. "Shikis," she began, addressing the elder with a term of respect. "Your words are not lost." He meant no disrespect. His tongue is simply clumsy, like a child's. The silence that followed was so profound, Vivian could hear the frantic drumming of her own heart. Mr. Begay's eyes, which had been hard as obsidian, widened in astonishment. Mr. Yazzie, who had been staring grimly at his plate, sat bolt upright, his back ramrod straight. Vivian continued, her voice gaining a quiet confidence. The timid server's tone was gone, replaced by the calm authority of a diplomat. She turned her head slightly toward Holden, translating for him, but her eyes remained on the elders. He did not say the word for deal and sky, Mr. Van Doren. He said, "The man who sells the sky cannot be trusted to protect the earth." Holden stared, his mouth agape. Davies the translator looked as if he might faint. "He was not questioning your environmental studies," Vivian explained, her gaze shifting back to Mr. Begay. "He was questioning your approach. He said you speak of the land as a resource to be extracted, not as a mother to be honored. He was not canceling the deal. He was asking if you understood the difference." She then turned her full attention back to the Navajo men, her posture poised and respectful. "Mr. Van Doren is a man of the city," she continued in their language. "He sees in lines and numbers, but his vision for this project is to build a future powered by the sun and the wind, a future that honors the sky. Perhaps you can teach him how to honor the earth as well." For the next 15 minutes, Vivian Adler, the $17.50 an hour waitress, stood beside the table and mediated a multi-billion-dollar negotiation. She didn't just translate words, she translated worlds. She wove a bridge between the corporate rapacity of Wall Street and the deep, sacred ecology of the DNA. She spoke of balance, hozhu, and how it could apply to profit and loss statements. She used her deep, improbable knowledge to reframe the entire conversation. When it was over, Mr. Begay and Mr. Yazzie rose. They did not look at Holden. They looked at Vivian. Mr. Begay stepped toward her and spoke softly in English for the first time that evening, a warm, genuine smile spreading across his face. "You have your father's wisdom, little one. It is good to hear it again." He then placed a hand briefly over his heart and gave her a deep, respectful nod. Vivian's composure finally cracked. A flicker of raw emotion crossed her face. She simply nodded in return, unable to speak. The two men left the table, the deal not yet signed, but the path to it now cleared of all obstacles. Holden Van Doren did not move. He sat amidst the wreckage of his half-eaten meal, staring at Vivian. The air around him crackled with the silent, furious energy of a complete and total paradigm shift. He watched her as she began to instinctively clear the plates, her hands now perfectly steady. "Who?" he said, his voice a dangerously soft whisper. "Are you?" "I'm your waitress, sir," Vivian replied, the mask of professional neutrality clicking back into place. "No," Holden said, rising from his chair. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and withdrew a slim, titanium card case. He didn't toss a card onto the table. He placed it down with deliberate precision. It was black, impossibly heavy, with his name embossed in stark silver letters. "You were my waitress. You're fired." Vivian's heart crashed into the soles of her worn-out shoes. Fired? For saving his entire green energy division. "My office," he commanded, adjusting his cuffs. "Tomorrow. 7 a.m., don't be late." He turned to the ghost-white translator. "Davies, you're finished. Send my office an invoice for your plane ticket back to whatever Ivy League hellhole you crawled out of." Holden Van Doren strode out of the restaurant without a single backward glance, leaving Vivian standing in a constellation of dirty plates and crystal glasses, holding a business card that felt like a detonator. The walk to the kitchen felt 1,000 miles long. The other servers stared, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. Her manager, Greg, was waiting by the swinging doors, his arms crossed over his stained white shirt. Greg was a man who subsisted on a diet of microwaved burritos and the petty miseries of others. "Well, well, Adler," he sneered, his voice loud enough for the dishwashers to hear. "Quite the little performance. What was that? Some party trick you picked up?" "Greg, please, You broke the #1 rule, Vivian," he said, jabbing a greasy finger in her direction. "You do not engage the guests. You are scenery. You are a ghost. You think you're better than this place?" He was about to lose the biggest deal of his life. I don't care if he was about to spontaneously combust. Greg's face was red with fury. "Your job is to pour water and keep your mouth shut. You're a liability." He already fired me," Vivian whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Mr. Van Doren." Greg's face contorted into a smug, triumphant grin. "See? The big shots don't like it when the help gets ideas above their station. Now clock out, get your things, and get out of my restaurant." In the cramped, mildew-scented locker room, she changed out of her uniform and into her threadbare jeans and a thin sweater. Fired. She had just salvaged a man's legacy, and she was unemployed. The $140 in tips felt like Monopoly money. The final notice from Meadowlark was for $6,200. They would transfer her father to a state-run facility by the end of the week. A place, the doctors had warned, where his specialized care would cease, where he would be just another body in a bed, waiting to die. She clutched the heavy black business card. Van Doren Capital, One World Trade Center, 102nd floor. It was a cruel, twisted joke. He'd fired her, then summoned her. Was it to sign a non-disclosure agreement? To threaten her with a lawsuit for interfering? She imagined a room full of lawyers with teeth like sharks, ready to tear her apart for the crime of being useful. She rode the subway home, the last rattling train of the night, to her tiny apartment in Queens. The building smelled of boiled cabbage and regret. She sat on the edge of her lumpy mattress, the business card lying on her nightstand, a black hole in the dim light. Holden Van Doren, CEO. The name echoed, but it was the words of the elder, Mr. Begay, that haunted her. "You have your father's wisdom, little one. It is good to hear it again." She walked to the small, cluttered bookshelf that dominated one wall. Behind a row of worn linguistics textbooks, she pulled out a heavy, leather-bound volume. It wasn't a book. It was a photo album. She opened it to the last page. The photograph was of a vibrant, laughing man with kind eyes and a brilliant mind, his arm around a teenage Vivian. They were standing on the steps of the Smithsonian. The man was Roman Adler, a celebrated professor of ethnolinguistics and military cryptography, the world's foremost expert on the Navajo code talkers of World War II. And in the photo next to it, taken at a university gala years earlier, was her father, deep in conversation with a much younger, but no less intense, Holden Van Doren. Vivian's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a random billionaire. It was him. The man who had once sought her father's expertise for a historical documentary project, who had visited their home, eaten at their table, and then, a year later, used a ruthless, predatory short-selling strategy to bankrupt the small, ethical tech firm her father had invested his entire life savings in. The firm's collapse had been the catalyst, the shock that triggered the massive stroke, leaving Roman Adler a prisoner in his own brilliant mind. She sank onto the floor, the card cold in her hand. He didn't recognize me. Years of stress, grief, and cheap food had worn her down, erased the bright-eyed girl from the photograph. She was just a waitress, a ghost. He hadn't just fired her. He had summoned the daughter of the man whose life he had casually destroyed, and he had no idea. The fear that had been churning in her stomach for hours vanished, replaced by a slow, creeping, glacial rage. He wanted to see her at 7 a.m. He was about to get his wish. The lobby of One World Trade Center was not a room. It was a statement of dominance over man and nature. The ceilings soared into the stratosphere, all white marble, steel, and glass. The air hummed with the silent, relentless energy of global finance. Vivian, wearing the only professional outfit she owned, a simple 10-year-old black dress she'd bought for a scholarship interview, felt her cloak of invisibility return tenfold. The security guard at the main desk eyed her worn-out flats with unconcealed disdain. "Can I help you?" "I have a meeting with Holden Van Doren," she said, her voice far steadier than she felt. The guard's eyebrow climbed his forehead. "Mr. Van Doren doesn't have any appointments on his public schedule, and definitely not at 7 a.m. "He gave me this," Vivian said, sliding the heavy black card under the security glass. The guard's entire demeanor shifted. He didn't just glance at the card. He handled it with the reverence one might afford a holy relic. He typed furiously into his computer, his eyes widening. "My apologies, Ms. Adler. Right this way. Private elevator to the sky lobby." The elevator didn't ascend. It launched. When the doors whispered open on the 102nd floor, it was not to a reception area, but directly into Holden Van Doren's office. The room was less an office, and more a kingdom. 3 walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic, god-like view of the sprawling city below. In the center of the vast space sat a single, colossal desk carved from a single piece of reclaimed redwood. And behind it, staring out at his domain, stood Holden Van Doren. He was on the phone, his back to her. "No. Scuttle the deal. Buy their debt through the Shell Corp in the Caymans and break them up. I want their patents. I don't care about the employees. That's their CEO's problem. Handle it." He ended the call and turned, swiveling in his chair. He gestured to a single, brutally uncomfortable-looking leather chair in front of his desk. "You're early. I appreciate punctuality." Vivian sat, placing her worn handbag on her lap. Her hands were folded neatly on top of it. "Let's get a few things straight, Ms. Adler," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he pronounced her name. "Greg from the Gilded Stag is fired. I bought the restaurant this morning. I'm turning it into a parking garage. Davies is on a permanent blacklist from every executive recruitment firm in the Northern Hemisphere. You, however, are a different species entirely." He leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "You don't just speak Navajo. You speak it with a specific, academic fluency. You understood nuance, protocol, honor. You understood the concept of hoju as a business principle. Where does a waitress learn that?" This was the moment. She could lie, invent a story about a college course, a passionate hobby, or she could light the fuse. "My father is Roman Adler," she said, her voice clear and cold. The name hit the air and hung there, shimmering. Donovan. Van Doren's face remained a perfect, unreadable mask. There was no flicker of recognition, no jolt of surprise. He just stared at her, the silence stretching until it was thin and sharp enough to cut. "Roman Adler," he said finally, his voice flat. "The linguistics professor. Brilliant man, a romantic. He believed in things like corporate ethics and fair play." He gave a small, dismissive shrug. "He was a terrible investor." "He was my father," Vivian said, her fingernails digging into the cheap pleather of her handbag. "Yes, I'm aware." The 2 words slammed into Vivian with the force of a physical blow. "You knew. Last night you knew who I was?" "Of course not," Holden said, standing and walking to the vast window. "I'm not omniscient. I am, however, efficient. My security team ran a full background profile on you at 10 p.m. last night. The name Adler rang a bell, a quick cross-reference with my old files, and there it was. Roman Adler, the expert I consulted for a documentary that never got made. The man who lost his shirt, shorting one of my acquisitions. He turned back to her, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in his cold eyes. His daughter, a prodigy who won a full scholarship to study linguistics at Georgetown, ends up serving me overpriced wine. The universe has a dark sense of humor. You ruined him, Vivian whispered, the rage now a hot, metallic taste in her mouth. He made a bad bet, Holden corrected her calmly. The market is a casino, Miss Adler. He played a weak hand and lost. You, on the other hand, you appear to be holding an ace. He walked back to his desk. You're desperate. Your father is at Meadowlark. The bill is $6,200 past due. They're moving him on Monday. You work 60 hours a week and you're still sinking. You are brilliant. You are unique. And you are trapped. You are, in short, the perfect asset. He slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the polished redwood. I need you. The deal with the Diné Sovereign Trust is the cornerstone of my next 20 years. They don't trust me. But they trust, or at least respect, the legacy of your father. I'm not hiring a translator. I'm hiring a bridge. I'm creating a new position for you. Vice President of Cultural Liaison. Vivian opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the numbers, and for a moment her brain refused to process them. The salary was not just life-changing, it was reality-altering. It was enough to move her father to the best private neurological clinic in the world. It was enough to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. You want me to work for you? She said, her voice trembling with a toxic mix of fury and hope. You want me to use my father's name to help the man who destroyed him? What I did was business, Holden said, his voice devoid of emotion. This is also business. I am offering you a way out, Vivian. The alternative is you stand on your principles while your father rots away in a state-funded warehouse, and you go back to pouring coffee for men like Greg. Your pride or your father's life. The choice seems remarkably simple to me. He was right. It was a simple, brutal, and perfect cage. He wasn't offering her a job. He was offering her a golden leash, forged from her own love and desperation. If I do this, Vivian said, looking up, the fire in her eyes now banked to a cold, hard glow. I have conditions. Holden actually laughed, a short, harsh bark. Conditions? You are in no position to— I am in the only position, Vivian interrupted, and the steel in her voice made him pause. You don't just need a translator. You need me. You need Roman Adler's daughter. Mr. Begay didn't respond to my language skills. He responded to my father's legacy. Without that, you have nothing. So these are the terms. She pushed the folder back toward him. First, this salary is doubled. Second, I am not a liaison. I am the executive vice president of a new division, the Van Doren Tribal Affairs and Heritage Council. I report directly to you, and only you. Third, she took a deep, steadying breath. You will not just pay the outstanding bill for my father's care. You will establish a multi-million-dollar perpetual trust in his name to fund his care for the rest of his life at the Avalon Clinic. The funds will be transferred from your personal account, not the company's. And it will be done before I walk out of this room. Holden stared at her. The waitress was gone. In her place was a queen, forged in poverty and rage, negotiating the terms of her surrender as if it were a victory. He saw the same brilliance he'd seen in her father, But this time, it wasn't diluted by sentiment. It was sharpened by it. It was a weapon. He picked up his desk phone. "Catherine, get legal and finance up here. Now, we're creating a new EVP position and a personal trust fund. Yes, she's waiting." He hung up and leaned back, a slow, unsettling smile of pure admiration spreading across his face. "The jet leaves for Arizona in 4 hours. Be ready, Madam Executive." 4 hours later, Vivian was on a Gulfstream G100, slicing through the stratosphere. The cabin was silent, a hermetically sealed world of cream leather and polished chrome. Holden sat opposite her, his eyes closed, unmoving. Vivian was still wearing her old black dress, but in her new wallet was a corporate black card, and on her phone was a confirmation from the Avalon Clinic. Her father was being moved this afternoon. The relief was so profound. The relief was a physical blow, a wave of nausea and lightheadedness that threatened to buckle her knees. For a dizzying moment, she was no longer in the rarefied air of a Gulf Stream, but back in the suffocating humidity of the ER, the scent of antiseptic and fear clinging to her clothes as a doctor used the word catastrophic. That terror, a constant, low-grade hum beneath the surface of her life for years, had just been silenced. The trust was funded, the clinic was paid, her father was safe, the cage was unlocked, and in its place, a new one, gilded and spacious, had materialized around her. Madam Executive. The title was a foreign word, in a language she was only just learning to speak. It felt like a costume, yes. But more than that, it felt like an accusation. "They will test you," Holden said, his voice slicing through the cabin's engineered silence. His eyes remained closed, but his stillness was that of a predator, not a man at rest. Vivian started, the sudden sound jarring her from her reverie. "What?" "Begay and Yazzie," he clarified, his tone flat, devoid of the fury she knew must be simmering beneath. "They respected your father. They will not extend that same courtesy to you indefinitely. They see you as my tool, a sentimental lever. They will use his memory, his honor, to press for more concessions, to test the limits of your authority. They will appeal to the daughter, not the executive." "And what would you have me do?" she asked, the question laced with an irony so sharp it could draw blood. Holden's eyes snapped open. They were not angry. They were something far more terrifying, analytical. They were the eyes of a man observing a fascinating, dangerous new variable in a complex equation. You will do precisely what you have been doing. You will use their respect for his memory as both a shield and a sword. But you will do it for the benefit of Van Doren Capital. You will close this deal, my deal, on the terms we have established. Do not, for 1 second, allow sentiment to cloud your judgment. You've proven you have a killer instinct, Ms. Adler. Don't lose it now that you're well fed. "After today," Vivian said, her voice a low, steady murmur that was a perfect echo of his own. "I don't believe I'm in any danger of forgetting who I work for. Or why." The subsequent 6 months were a crucible. Vivian moved through a world she had previously only glimpsed through the service entrance. It was a disorienting kaleidoscope of private jets, boardrooms that smelled of old leather and new money, and tense negotiations conducted in the starkly beautiful, wind-swept landscapes of the Diné nation. She shed the skin of the waitress, the ghost in the uniform, and donned the armor of her new role with a chilling, methodical competence. The rage that had fueled her initial confrontation with Holden had cooled, solidifying into a core of unyielding purpose. She was no longer merely a translator. She became a strategist, a diplomat, an ethnographer in a bespoke suit. She spent her nights not in sterile hotel rooms watching cable news, but devouring her father's life's work. She unearthed his unpublished manuscripts, his field notes, his correspondence. She wasn't just reading his research on linguistics. She was communing with his soul, absorbing his profound understanding of a world where landscape, language, and lineage were inextricably woven together. She discovered that the proposed mining site, a barren patch of desert on Holden's geological surveys, was known to the Diné as Tse Bithai, the Rock with Wings, a place central to the creation story of the hero twins. She learned that Mr. Begay's great-grandfather, Chi, had not only been a code talker, but had been one of the men her own father had interviewed for his seminal work on the subject. These were not data points to be leveraged. They were sacred threads in a tapestry she was just beginning to comprehend. Armed with this knowledge, she didn't exploit their beliefs. She honored them. She went to Holden not with a problem, but with a solution that was both culturally resonant and brutally pragmatic. She proposed redrawing the operational boundaries to leave Tsebitai untouched, a concession that would cost millions in initial surveying, but would be repaid 1,000-fold in political capital. She suggested the creation of a new foundation funded by a percentage of the mine's profits, dedicated to the preservation of the Diné language and the digital archiving of the elders' stories. She proposed naming it the Roman Adler Chi Begay Heritage Fund. Holden, to the astonishment of his entire executive team, agreed to every point without a flicker of debate. An investment in legacy is an investment in stability, he'd stated in the boardroom, his cold gaze daring anyone to challenge him. Goodwill is an asset, not an expense. Ms. Adler understands this. I suggest the rest of you learn from her. In that moment, Vivian understood something profound about him. He was not a man driven by simple greed. He was driven by a desire for permanence, for a legacy carved into the bedrock of the world. He had simply never conceived that the tools to achieve it could be anything other than force and capital. Slowly, painstakingly, she earned the trust of the Diné Council. They stopped seeing her as Holden's weapon and began to see her as a bridge between two worlds. Mr. Begay started calling her Saintbak Adzomonad Lehe, changing woman, a name of immense respect, a nod to the mythological figure who brings creation, wisdom, and balance. The deal, once a hostile takeover disguised as a partnership, was being reborn as something more complex, more durable. Her weekends were a sacred ritual of return. She would fly back to New York and drive to the Avalon Clinic, a place of serene, sun-drenched gardens and quiet corridors where the air itself seemed to hum with healing. Her father's suite was a world away from the cramped beige room at Meadowlark. Here, he had a view of an ancient oak tree and a team of specialists who spoke of neural pathways and experimental therapies with gentle, hopeful voices. He remained lost to her, a ship becalmed in the silent sea of his own mind. His eyes, once so brilliant and alive with curiosity, were vacant. His hands, which had once taught her to write her first words, lay still upon the crisp, white sheets. But he was safe. He was cared for. He was honored. She would sit beside him for hours, the scent of lavender and clean linen, a soothing balm. She held his cool, unresponsive hand, and she would talk, her voice a soft counterpoint to the rhythmic sigh of the ventilator. I used your notes on kinship protocol to restructure the water rights clause, Dad, she'd whisper, tracing the veins on the back of his hand. They were trying to negotiate it as a commodity. You taught me to see it as a familial obligation. It changed everything. They listened. You were right, Dad. It's never just about the words. It's about the world the words create. During the week, she lived in the belly of the beast. Van Doren Capital was a kingdom, and Holden was its absolute monarch. The other EVPs, men like Alistair Finch, the COO and Holden's longtime hatchet man, circled her with the predatory patience of sharks. They saw her as an anomaly, a freak weather event that had somehow swept a waitress into a corner office. Quite the Cinderella story, Finch had sneered at her one afternoon in the executive dining room, his voice a slick, condescending drawl. From slinging hash to shaping policy. But don't get too comfortable. Holden tires of his novelties. Once this deal is signed, and he's done using your father's ghost for cover, you'll be back on the subway with the rest of the little people. Vivian didn't look up from the report she was reading. My father's ghost, as you so elegantly put it, is about to secure this company's future for the next half-century, she replied, her voice as cool and crisp as the salad on her plate. Perhaps you should show it a little more respect. Ghosts have a way of lingering. But Finch's words, venomous as they were, had planted a seed, not of doubt, but of clarity. She was not a novelty. She was not a ghost's echo. She had been forged into something new in the fires of her grief and his ambition. The rage that had once been her fuel had been transmuted into something far more potent. Purpose. She was not here merely to save her father. She was here for a reckoning. Her executive credentials granted her access to the deepest, darkest archives of the company's servers. Late at night, in the sterile silence of the corporate apartment overlooking the glittering, indifferent city, she began to dig. She waded through terabytes of encrypted financial data, searching for the ghost of a small, ethical tech firm her father had believed in. She cross-referenced trades, shell corporations, and anonymous short sells, following a trail of digital breadcrumbs that led into the labyrinth of Holden's offshore empire. It took 3 months of painstaking nocturnal work, but she found it. Not a smoking gun, but a quiet, damning whisper. A single encrypted wire transfer from a holding company in the Cayman Islands, one she now knew was a personal slush fund for Holden, to a notorious financial journalist known for his devastating, well-timed hit pieces. The transfer was dated 1 week before the story broke that sent her father's company into a death spiral. The discovery did not bring the hot rush of fury she expected. It brought a terrifying, glacial calm. The truth was worse than she had imagined. Holden hadn't just been a passive shark smelling blood in the water. He had been the harpoon. He had paid to have the story planted, engineered the crisis, and then profited from the wreckage. He had not just ruined her father. He had orchestrated his crucifixion for a few points on a stock. She copied the file, along with a dozen others documenting his most ruthless and legally ambiguous tactics, onto a tiny, encrypted drive no larger than her thumbnail. She sealed it in a small plastic bag, and then, with the steady hands of a surgeon, she hid it in the one place no one in her new world would ever think to look. Inside the worn, beaded lizard charm her father had bought for her at a roadside stand in Arizona 20 years ago. A good luck token, a memory, and now a weapon. She was ready. The final signing ceremony was scheduled for New York. When Holden asked her to select a suitable venue, one that would convey prestige and neutrality, her choice was immediate: the Gilded Stag. The irony was a flavor so sharp and exquisite it was almost painful. She stood in the same private dining room, not in a black and white uniform of servitude, but in a custom-tailored Acris pantsuit the color of midnight. The room was filled with the low hum of anticipation. Lawyers shuffled papers, executives exchanged self-congratulatory smiles, and the Navajo delegation, led by Mr. Big A and Mr. Yazzie, sat with a quiet, monumental dignity. Holden was at the head of the table, a king surveying his newly conquered territory, radiating a triumph so potent it was almost a physical force. The final documents, bound in rich blue leather, were laid out on the polished mahogany. Mr. Begay caught her eye across the table and gave a slow, respectful nod. "You have brought honor to your father's name, changing woman," he said, his voice resonating with sincerity. "You have brought Hoju." "The honor has been all mine, Mr. Begay," she replied, her voice perfectly steady, a placid lake over a fathomless depth. Holden rose, a flute of champagne appearing in his hand as if by magic. He was ready for his victory speech. "A toast," he began, his voice filling the room. "To the future. To a partnership built on mutual respect and shared prosperity. To a new era of—" "Before we sign," Vivian said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the celebratory atmosphere like a shard of glass. The room fell utterly silent. Every head turned towards her. Holden's smile didn't vanish, but it tightened, the muscles in his jaw bunching. A flicker of annoyance, of impatience, crossed his face. Alistair Finch scoffed audibly. "For God's sake, what now? The ink is barely dry." Vivian ignored him, her gaze locked on Holden. "This entire negotiation has been predicated on a foundation of trust and honor, principles embodied by the legacy of my father, Roman Adler." "Of course," Holden said smoothly, recovering his composure, though a new, wary light had entered his eyes. "His spirit has been a guiding force for all of us." "I'm so glad you feel that way," Vivian said, her voice dropping a half octave, becoming something colder, heavier. She reached into the pocket of her jacket, and her fingers closed around the familiar shape of the beaded lizard. She placed it on the table. With a practiced, deliberate movement, she opened a hidden clasp and let the tiny USB drive fall out. It landed on the polished wood with a soft, almost imperceptible click that echoed in the tomb-like silence of the room. "Because my father also believed in truth," she continued, her voice now ringing with a terrible crystalline clarity. "On this drive is the full, unredacted proof that the collapse of his company was not, as you once told me, the result of a bad bet. It was the result of a deliberate, meticulously orchestrated campaign of corporate sabotage, initiated, funded, and executed by you, Holden Van Doren." A collective, strangled gasp went through the room. The lawyers froze, their pens hovering over the signature lines. Mr. Begay's face became a mask of carved stone. Alistair Finch's jaw went slack, his face draining of all color as he looked from the drive to Holden. Holden didn't move. He was a statue of ice and fury. The champagne flute in his hand was perfectly still. "This drive," Vivian went on, her eyes boring into his, "contains the wire transfer receipts to the journalist you hired. It contains the encrypted emails outlining the strategy. It contains the sworn affidavit of that same journalist, who, it turns out, developed a conscience when faced with a federal investigation. It is the complete story of how you didn't just profit from my father's downfall. You engineered it for the price of a mid-range sedan. I have arranged for this information to be delivered to the SEC, the Southern District of New York, and the Wall Street Journal, should I press a single key on my phone." Holden's face was a canvas of pure, murderous rage, yet his voice, when it came, was preternaturally calm. "What is this? Blackmail?" "No," Vivian said softly. "This is the final term of the negotiation. You see, the deal on the table is a good one, but my father would have made it a just one." She shifted her gaze to the stunned Navajo delegation. "The current agreement gives Van Doren Capital a 70% stake in the project. The new agreement—" She slid a single, freshly printed addendum across the table. Gives them 51%. The remaining 19% will be transferred, in perpetuity, directly to the Diné Sovereign Trust. Furthermore, 2 permanent seats on the Van Doren Capital Board of Directors will be created and occupied by Mr. Begay and Mr. Yazzie. She turned her eyes back to Holden, whose face was now ashen. You will still be the majority shareholder. Your green energy legacy will proceed. But you will have partners, not subjects. You will have a conscience at your table. Every quarter, you will have to look them in the eye and justify your actions. You will be forced, perhaps for the first time in your life, to learn the meaning of Hoju. That is the price of my silence. That is the cost of what you did to my father. The room was a vacuum, all the air sucked out by the gravity of her words. Holden stared at her, the mask of civilization stripped away, revealing the pure, cornered predator beneath. She could see the calculations whirling behind his eyes, the cost of the shares against the cost of total annihilation, the public disgrace, the shareholder revolt. Prison. He looked at the tiny USB drive, a digital atom bomb. He looked at the stony, unmovable faces of the elders, who now understood they were not just negotiating a mining deal, but bearing witness to a moral reckoning. And then his gaze returned to her, to the waitress, the ghost, the changing woman who had just put a gun to the head of his entire world. A long, agonizing silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, something extraordinary happened. A slow, terrible, and utterly genuine smile spread across Holden Van Doren's face. It was not a smile of admiration. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated ruin, the expression of a man watching his own fortress, which he had believed to be impregnable, crumble to dust around him. He slowly, deliberately, set the untouched champagne flute down on the table. He picked up his own pen, a heavy, black instrument of power. He uncapped it with a decisive snap, and with a hand that did not tremble, he signed the addendum. Then he pushed the entire stack of documents toward Mr. Begay. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice a low, gravelly purr that held the sound of grinding stone. "It appears my executive vice president has just taught me the final and most important lesson in the art of the deal. The one with the most leverage wins." He looked directly at Vivian, and for the first time, she saw not a predator, not a boss, but simply a man, undone. "Congratulations, Miss Adler. You have your justice." He turned and walked out of the room without another word, leaving behind a shattered silence, a signed contract, and a legacy that was no longer his alone to write. It was hers. A legacy of justice, built not from the ashes of revenge, but on the solid ground of balance.